The stars in the Cathara expanse were old and tired. They burned dimmer than most stars in the galaxy, and the space around them was quiet. The kind of quiet that made even experienced soldiers nervous. It was the kind of place where nothing was supposed to happen. No trade routes passed through it. No colonies existed near it. No great empires had ever bothered to claim it, because there was nothing worth claiming. That was exactly why Ambassador Velsorn of the Tharaki liked using it as a patrol corridor. His ship, the Eternal Thought, was a long and beautiful vessel. It was built with smooth, curved edges that cut through space like a blade through water. Every surface was polished. Every system was precise. The Tharaki had been building starships for over 4,000 years, and it showed in every single bolt and panel of the Eternal Thought. Tamar, it was the kind of ship that made other species feel small and a little embarrassed about their own technology. Velsorn stood at the center of the bridge. He was tall, even by Tharaki standards, with pale blue skin and 4 narrow eyes that moved independently of each other. He was watching 2 of those eyes looking at the long stretch of nothing outside the main viewing screen, and he was bored. Patrol duty at the edge of the Cathara expanse was never interesting. It had never been interesting in the past 12 rotations, and he had no reason to believe today would be any different. Then his science officer, Mirath, made a small sound. It was not a big sound. It was the kind of sound a person makes when they see something that does not match what they were expecting, and their brain is trying to catch up. A soft, short noise, like a word that got stopped before it could leave the mouth. Velsorn turned one of his eyes toward her. What is it? Mirath did not answer right away. She was leaning close to her console, her fingers moving quickly over the sensor controls, running the same scan again. Her other 2 eyes stayed fixed on the screen. I am getting a reading, she said slowly, but it does not make sense. Sensors malfunction? No. I have run the check 3 times. She straightened up and turned to face him. All 4 of her eyes were pointing at him now, which meant she was serious. Where there is a vessel. Velsorn looked out at the viewing screen. There was nothing there, just stars. Where? Bearing 47 by 12, approximately 9,000 kilometers. She paused. It is very large. Velsorn moved to her console and looked at the data himself. He was quiet for a long time. On the screen, the sensor readout was showing him numbers and shapes that he kept expecting to change, because surely they were wrong. The vessel was 3.8 kilometers long. Well, that alone was not shocking. The Tharaki had built vessels that size. The Solveth Empire had vessels even bigger. Size alone was not the problem. The problem was everything else. There is no quantum field around it, Velsorn said. Correct. No dark matter compression signature. Correct. No anti-gravity stabilizers. No phase shielding. No energy lattice of any kind. He looked up at her. How is it holding its own structure together at that size without any of those systems? Mirath looked at the screen and said the words very carefully, like she was not fully sure she believed them herself. According to the scan, the hull appears to be made of layers of metal. Thick layers. Very thick. And there are internal support beams running through the entire frame at regular intervals. She brought up a structural diagram on a secondary screen. It showed a cross-section of the mystery vessel's hull. The layers were almost comically deep. The outermost layer alone is approximately 40 meters of ferrous alloy composite. Velsorn stared at the cross-section. That is not engineering. That is just piling metal on top of more metal. Yes, and beneath those layers there appear to be pipes, many pipes, carrying pressurized gas and liquid through the entire body of the ship. She hesitated. The liquid appears to be water. The bridge went quiet. Several other crew members had stopped working and were now listening to this conversation with the focused attention of people who could not believe what they were hearing. Water, Velsorn repeated. Yes, sir. He straightened up and folded his hands behind his back, which was what he did when he was trying to stay calm while his mind was working quickly. What is its drive signature? Mirath almost looked apologetic. That is also unusual. I am reading multiple drive types operating simultaneously. There is a large fusion torch drive at the rear, but there are also ion drives, chemical booster stages, and something generating enormous thermal output in the core, possibly a reactor of the fission type. Fission! Velsorn said the word like it tasted strange. Fission reactors were something the Tharaki had used roughly 3,000 years ago, before they had discovered better methods. And the idea of a species still using fission as a primary power source on a military vessel of this size was difficult to process. Is it armed? Mirath pulled up the weapons analysis and looked at it in silence for a moment. Then she read it out loud, slowly. There are what appear to be large electromagnetic rail acceleration weapons along the dorsal and ventral surfaces. 24 of them, based on the magnetic field signatures. They are enormous. She highlighted them on the diagram. In each one was nearly a third of a kilometer long. There are also sealed bays along the sides of the vessel, likely missile storage, and a very large number of smaller point defense weapons covering almost every angle of the hull. Velsorn looked at the diagram. The vessel, if it could be called that, looked like someone had taken all the weapons they could find and bolted them onto a very large piece of metal and told it to go somewhere. There was no elegance to it, no flow, no design philosophy that he could recognize or respect. It was blunt and heavy and completely without grace. Is it moving? He asked. Yes, slowly. It is accelerating toward us. Thermal exhaust from the rear drive is significant. I am also detecting what appears to be gas venting from several points along the hull, possibly from internal pressure systems. It is leaking? That is one interpretation. Velsorn stood very still for a few seconds. Then he made a decision. Run the scan again. A full spectrum. I want to be absolutely certain of what we are seeing. The scan ran. The results came back. They were identical to the first two scans. The vessel was real. It was 3.8 kilometers of layered metal and pipes and enormous guns, and it was slowly moving through the Kethera expanse like something that had never been told it was not supposed to be there. Then the communication system on the bridge made a sound, a hailing signal, simple, clear, and using a standard conclave frequency. Someone on that vessel knew how to reach them. Velsorn looked at his communications officer, who looked back at him with an expression of pure confusion. Velsorn gave a small nod. The channel opened. The voice that came through was human. It was relaxed. It was almost cheerful. It belonged to a woman, and she spoke in Galactic Common with an accent that Velsorn did not immediately recognize. Hello out there. This is Captain Mara Osei, commanding officer of the UES Unyielding Principle, operating under the banner of the United Earth Sovereignty. We're on a standard patrol and we picked up your vessel on our own sensors about 20 minutes ago. A brief pause. Look, I'll be direct with you. We're not looking for trouble. We're actually looking for a navigational beacon. Ours got knocked loose during our last engagement, and we've been running on internal charts for about 6 days. If anyone out there has a spare, or can at least give us a positional ping, we would very much appreciate it. Captain Osei out. The channel closed. The bridge of the eternal thought was absolutely silent. Velsorn slowly turned to look at Mirath. She was staring at the communications panel with an expression that he had never seen on her face before. He was fairly certain it was on his face too, because he could feel it. A strange mixture of confusion, disbelief, and something close to awe that he did not yet want to admit to. The vessel that should not have been able to move was moving. The vessel that should not have been able to hold itself together was holding itself together. It had survived an engagement of some kind. It had said so. It had sensors capable of detecting the eternal thought, which was built to be nearly invisible to conventional scanning. And it had hailed them on an open conclave frequency, casually to ask for a navigation beacon. Sir, said Mirath quietly. What do we do? Velsorn looked at the viewing screen. The unyielding principle was visible now, a dark, massive shape against the stars, moving with the slow, heavy certainty of something that had decided to go somewhere and was not particularly interested in what stood in its way. Venting gas curled away from its hull in thin silver streams. The thermal bloom from its engines made it look almost like it was breathing. It was, without question, the ugliest ship he had ever seen. It was also, what he was beginning to suspect, one of the most dangerous. Get me a secure channel to Conclave High Command, he said. His voice was steady. He was a professional. Priority 1. I need to speak with the Admiral directly. He paused, watching the unyielding principle grow slightly larger on the screen as it crept closer through the dark. And someone send those humans a positional ping. They asked nicely. Meredith looked at him for a moment, then nodded and began working her console. And around the bridge, other crew members exchanged glances. Quiet looks that carried the same unspoken message. Something had changed today. They did not yet know exactly what, but the feeling was there, clear and undeniable, like a vibration in the floor that comes just before something very large arrives. The report that Velsorn sent to Conclave High Command was 17 pages long. It contained full sensor data, structural analysis, weapons assessment, and communications transcripts. One at the very end, in a section he labeled Personal Observation, he wrote 4 sentences that his superiors would later quote in meetings for years. I have patrolled the Cathara expanse for 9 rotations. I have encountered vessels from 22 known species. I have never seen anything like this ship. I do not believe our current models of physics fully explain how it exists. He sent the report and then stood at the viewing screen for a long time, in watching the unyielding principle move through the stars. It was leaving a trail of heat and exhaust behind it. Its hull, under enhanced visual sensors, was scarred and patched in dozens of places, marks from weapons fire, from impacts, from damage that had been repaired by hand, and was visible because no one had bothered to make the repairs look clean. They had just made them hold. That, he thought, said something important. He was not yet sure what, but he intended to find out. While on the other side of that 9,000-kilometer gap, on the bridge of the unyielding principle, Captain Mara Ose accepted the positional ping from the Tharaki vessel, marked it in her charts, leaned back in her command chair, and told her navigator to set a new course. She did not think much about the alien ship watching her. There would be time for diplomacy and conversation later. Right now, she had a patrol to finish, a crew to feed, and a list of repair jobs that was currently 43 items long and growing. She picked up her coffee, found it was cold, drank it anyway, and got back to work. The stars of the Cathara expanse burned quietly around both ships, and somewhere in the space between them, something had begun. Something none of them could name yet, but all of them could feel. The galaxy had just had its first good look at the unyielding principle. It had not yet decided what to make of what it saw, and that was about to change. The report from Ambassador Velsorn arrived at Conclave High Command at the 3rd hour of the morning cycle, when most of the staff were either asleep or sitting quietly at their stations doing routine work. The duty officer who received it read the first 3 pages, stopped, read them again, and then walked directly to the Admiral's private quarters and knocked on the door. This was not something duty officers did lightly. Waking an admiral in the 3rd hour was the kind of decision that ended careers if the reason turned out to be unimportant. The duty officer knocked anyway. Admiral Sen Ra, a Solveth of advanced age and considerable reputation, opened the door in her sleeping robe with the expression of someone ready to say something sharp and permanent. She looked at the duty officer's face, and the sharp words did not come. Instead, she took the data pad from the officer's hand, read the first page, went and said simply, "Get everyone in." By the 4th hour, the main conference chamber of Conclave High Command was full. They had assembled quickly. Admirals, ship architects, weapons theorists, physicists, and diplomatic advisors from 11 of the 17 species that made up the Galactic Conclave. Some of them were still straightening their uniforms. Some had clearly not slept. All of them were looking at the same sensor data from the Eternal Thought, and all of them were making variations of the same face. The face of a person who understands numbers very well and is staring at numbers that should not be possible. Admiral Sen Ra stood at the head of the long table. She had read the full report 3 times on the way to the chamber, and she was still not comfortable with it. She was not a person who liked being uncomfortable. She had built her entire career on being the one who understood things when others were confused. "So now, let us go through this systematically," she said. Her voice was calm. She was good at making her voice calm, even when her mind was moving fast. "Structural analysis first. Architect Deveni, your assessment." Architect Deveni of the Vreth, who had designed 6 of the Conclave's most advanced warships and was widely considered the finest living expert on starship construction, stood up. He was a small creature with wide black eyes and 6 delicate fingers on each hand. And he looked like he had not slept and did not expect to sleep anytime soon. The hull design is... He paused. I want to choose my words carefully. It is not sophisticated. It uses no resonance layering, no quantum bonded alloys, no phase distribution plating. What it uses is simple physical thickness. He brought up the cross-section diagram on the main display screen. The image drew several quiet sounds from around the table. The alien equivalent of sharp intakes of breath. Here's the outermost hull layer is approximately 40 meters of standard ferrous composite alloy. Below that, alternating layers of ceramic heat-resistant material and what the scan identifies as reinforced concrete. Silence. Concrete, said Vice Admiral Theron of the Dravani, a large gray-skinned species known for their direct manner. As in hardened mineral aggregate, the substance primitives use to make ground-level structures. Yes. On a starship. Yes. A starship of 3.8 kilometers in length. Yes. Devaney looked around the table. I understand the reaction. I had the same one. But consider what this achieves. A vessel with that depth of physical layering, even using entirely basic materials, is extraordinarily difficult to destroy by conventional energy weapons. Plasma lances, particle beams, even phase disruptors. All of these weapons are designed with the assumption that a target vessel has a certain depth of hull, because no rational designer wastes mass on unnecessary thickness when better materials exist. But if you simply ignore the concept of efficiency and put 40 meters of metal in the way, you create a problem for those weapons that they were not designed to solve. Devaney sat down. The room stayed quiet for a moment. The internal structure, Senra said. Ask the pipes. A different analyst stood. A Tharaki physicist named Oral, who studied propulsion systems. The vessel runs an internal network of pressurized water and steam pipes throughout its entire frame. At first, this appears to be purely primitive thermal management, and it is in part, but the network also functions as a kind of hydraulic structural support system. The pressurized liquid running through the pipes helps distribute physical stress across the entire hull in a way that supplements the support beams. She brought up her own diagram. It is not elegant, it is not efficient, but it works. Under stress testing simulations, this vessel's hull should be able to absorb impacts that would crack quantum-bonded alloy plating of equivalent mass, was simply because the physical material distribution is so deep and so redundant. How does it move? Asked another voice from the table. Oral nodded, already expecting the question. This is where it becomes genuinely interesting. The vessel uses no single drive system. It uses several running at the same time. A large fusion torch is the primary drive. Old technology, but reliable and enormously powerful at scale. Supporting it are ion drives, chemical boosters, and what appears to be a gravity-assist maneuvering system using the ship's own mass distribution. She looked at her notes. No single component of its drive system is impressive. Together they produce thrust that is significant, not fast, not graceful, but consistent and very, very difficult to simply stop. Admiral Senra nodded slowly. Weapons. The room seemed to lean in slightly. A conclave weapons analyst named Pret brought up the weapons assessment. The primary weapons are electromagnetic rail acceleration cannons. 24 of them. They work by accelerating a metal projectile, a solid metal projectile, no energy component, to a very high velocity using a magnetic rail system and then releasing it at the target. Pret looked uncomfortable. The projectile itself is simple metal, dense, heavy, very fast. Theron of the Dravani leaned forward. And the problem with that is? Our shield, said Pret. All standard conclave vessel shielding is designed around energy weapon deflection, phase barriers, plasma dispersal fields, resonance dampeners. They are all built to handle beams and energy bursts and particle streams. A solid metal object moving at high velocity is a fundamentally different physical problem. Our shields slow it, yes, but they do not stop it the way they would stop a plasma lance. He pulled up a simulation on the main screen, a standard conclave frigate with full shields, a rail cannon projectile. The result was not comfortable to look at. The mass and velocity of these projectiles, combined with the inadequacy of our standard shielding against kinetic impact, means the unyielding principle carries weapons that are, against our specific defense systems, disproportionately effective. The room was quiet again, a longer quiet this time. Then Drenok spoke. He was old, very old even by Solvet standards, and the Solvet lived a long time. He had been studying military history and weapons theory for longer than most of the species at the table had possessed space travel. He was sitting at the far end of the table, and he had not spoken until now, and when he did, everyone listened. "I want to draw the room's attention to a recovered battle record," he said. His voice was slow and dry, like paper. 3 weeks ago, the Dravani Corridor, a sovereignty raiding group, engaged an unidentified vessel. Based on the size and profile logged in that record, I believe that vessel was the unyielding principle. He brought the battle record up on the main screen. The footage was from a sovereignty sensor drone and showed a long, dark, familiar shape in the center of the frame, surrounded by the bright streaks of weapons fire. "The vessel takes 14 direct hits from Sovereignty Mark 7 plasma lances in the course of this engagement," Drenok said. "Watch carefully." They watched. When the plasma lances hit the unyielding principle one after another in a sequence that should have, by any standard model of starship durability, disabled or destroyed it. Instead, each hit carved into the outer hull layers, burned away metal, and left scorched craters. But the ship kept moving, kept firing. After the 14th hit, one of its rail cannon turrets that had been knocked offline physically rotated back into position. Someone had repaired it during the battle and fired. "Hey, now watch this part," said Drenok. On the screen, a sovereignty cruiser moved to flank the unyielding principle. The human ship, instead of trying to maneuver away, turned toward it. Then it accelerated directly into the cruiser's path and hit it. It rammed it. The sound that came from around the table was a collective noise that had no good translation. A sound made by people who cannot believe what they are seeing, but are definitely seeing it. The unyielding principle took damage from the collision. The sovereignty cruiser took significantly more. The cruiser broke apart. The unyielding principle continued. Drenok let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said the thing he had been building towards since he first read Velsorn's report. "We have spent thousands of years optimizing our ships. We remove anything unnecessary. We build for maximum efficiency. We treat mass as a problem to be solved and redundancy as waste. We are very good at this." He looked around the table slowly. "What we built in doing all of this are ships that work perfectly in the conditions we designed them for, and ships that break, sometimes badly, when reality does not cooperate." He gestured at the frozen image of the unyielding principle on the screen. These humans did not have the resources or the technology to optimize, so they did not optimize. They built something thick and redundant and heavy and full of backup systems and physical solutions to every problem they could anticipate. They built a ship that does not work well. He paused. "But it does not stop working, and there is a very large difference between those two things." He sat back in his chair. The room stayed quiet. Admiral Sen Ra looked at the image on the screen for a long moment. Then she looked at the people around the table, the architects and theorists and analysts and officers, and she said the thing that all of them had been slowly, reluctantly arriving at on their own. "We need to know more about these humans." She stood up from her chair, which meant the meeting was moving toward conclusion. "I want a diplomatic team assembled and sent to that vessel within 48 hours. I want a full crew behavioral analysis. I want engineering teams to learn everything the humans will let them learn about those drive systems and that hull construction. I want weapons analysts to model every possible engagement scenario involving that ship against our standard vessel types." She began to move toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "And I want someone to find out if there are more ships like that one. Because if the humans have built a fleet on these principles, we need to understand exactly what that means." The meeting ended. People began to move, to talk quietly, to send messages. The data from the Eternal Thoughts sensor scans spread through conclave high command systems and from there outward. And within hours, engineers and analysts on 17 worlds were looking at the same cross-section diagram of the unyielding principle's hull and making the same expressions Mareth had made on the Eternal Thoughts bridge. An expression that was difficult to describe. It was the expression of a person who has spent their whole life understanding something very well, and has just discovered that there is an entire other way of understanding it that they had never considered, and that the other way actually works. In his quarters, Drenuk sat alone for a long time after the meeting. He was looking at the battle record footage again, and at the moment when the unyielding principal turned toward the Sovereignty cruiser and accelerated, not away, toward. He watched it again, and again, and he thought about the word for what that was, and he eventually decided that the word was not a weapons term or an engineering term or a tactical term. The word was something much older and much more fundamental. The word was will, and he had not seen a warship express that particular quality so clearly in a very long time. Oh, he wrote a note to himself at the bottom of his analysis document. It was not an official observation. It was just 4 words that he did not yet know how to expand into a full argument, but felt very strongly were true. They built it alive. He saved the document, turned off his screen, and sat in the dark, thinking about a 4-kilometer ship that leaked water from its pipes and smelled of heat and metal and refused, against every expectation and every law of efficiency, to stop. The diplomatic shuttle from the conclave docked with the unyielding principal at the 13th hour, attaching to an external airlock on the ship's port side that was, according to the diplomatic team's pre-mission briefing, one of 7 working airlocks currently available. The other 4 were either sealed due to damage or, in one case, under active repair and not safe to use. The shuttle's docking clamp made contact and locked. There was a clunk, then a deeper clunk, and then a sound like something being hammered into place by hand from the other side, which was followed by a brief silence, and then the airlock light turned green. Delegate Marath of the Theraki, who had been specifically requested for the mission because she had the most direct experience with the vessel, looked at the green light and then at the 2 diplomatic security officers beside her. Neither of them said anything. The light was green. They proceeded. The airlock opened, and the first thing that hit them was the smell. It was not a bad smell exactly. It was a thick smell, heavy with machine oil and heated metal, and something sharp and slightly bitter that none of them could immediately identify. The corridor beyond the airlock was narrow by Theraki standards, with walls that were bare metal and covered in pipes of various sizes. Some of the pipes were painted in different colors. Some had labels on them in human writing. And a few had small handwritten notes attached with adhesive, which Marath's translation system processed as things like check pressure weekly, and this one runs hot, don't touch, and one that simply said do not. The lighting was functional rather than comfortable, bright enough to work by, placed at regular intervals along the ceiling. Marath noticed that some of the ceiling panels were open, showing more pipes and bundles of cable above them, and that in one section 2 humans were up inside the open ceiling, doing something with tools, their legs hanging down into the corridor while they worked. Neither of them stopped working when the delegation walked past. One of them called down, "Watch your heads," without looking to see who was there. The second thing Marath noticed was the sound. The Eternal Thought was very quiet when underway. Its systems operated with minimal vibration, and the ship had sound dampening built into its hull that made the interior feel calm. The unyielding principle was not quiet. It was a constant presence of sound, a deep, steady thrumming from the engines far below, the hiss and gurgle of pipes, the distant clang of metal on metal from somewhere, the hum of electrical systems, and occasionally from unseen directions, the sound of human voices in conversation. The ship sounded like it was alive and working hard, and it sounded like a thing that was operating at considerable effort and was not troubled by this fact. Captain Mara Osei met them at the junction where the docking corridor opened into one of the main internal passages. She was shorter than Marath had expected. Humans averaged considerably smaller than Theraki, and she was wearing a dark military uniform that had seen a great deal of use. There was a smear of something dark near the cuff of her left sleeve that she had either not noticed or not bothered to address. Her face was calm and open. She extended one hand toward Marath with the palm angled slightly upward and the fingers together, which Marath recognized as a human greeting gesture. Marath extended her own hand. The captain gripped it briefly and firmly and then released it. The handshake. Marath had read about it. Experiencing it was different from reading about it. There was something oddly direct about it, a deliberate physical acknowledgement of another person's presence. "Delegate Mirath," said Captain Osei, "welcome aboard the Unyielding Principal. I appreciate you making the trip." She looked at the delegation with comfortable ease. "I thought you might want a tour before we sit down and talk. We've had a lot of curious aliens ask for one." She said it without pride and without apology, simply as a fact. "We would be honored," said Mirath. The tour began. In the following 2 hours, Delegate Mirath and her team moved through sections of the Unyielding Principle that the captain called, at various points, mostly fine, functional, being worked on, and once regarding a stretch of corridor where one whole wall was covered in metal patches of slightly different colors welded over older damage. "She's been through some things." Each patch, Timwa the captain explained without being asked, represented a hull breach that had been repaired. Some from weapons fire, some from debris impacts, some from what she described with a slight smile as engineering experiments that didn't go the way we planned. The patches were not smooth. They did not match the surrounding wall. They looked exactly like what they were, repairs made by people who needed the wall to hold and did not have time to make it look good. And yet they held. Mirath pressed a hand against one of them as they passed and felt the solidity of it. Metal fused to metal, ugly and permanent. The engine room was the first place that truly stopped Mirath in her tracks. It was enormous. It occupied multiple decks in the lower rear section of the ship, and it was full of machinery that was large and loud and radiating heat in quantities that made Marath's environmental sensors give a quiet warning. Through the reinforced viewport that Captain Osei brought them to, they could see the main fusion torch assembly, a series of massive magnetic containment rings surrounding a core that glowed with a white-yellow light so intense that the viewport automatically darkened to compensate. Human crew members moved through the engine room below in small groups, checking displays, adjusting controls, carrying parts from one location to another. And they were wearing light protective suits and working with the easy confidence of people who were entirely comfortable in a room that was, by any measure, extremely dangerous. "How do they tolerate the heat?" asked one of the diplomatic security officers. "They train for it," said Captain Osei, looking through the viewport, "and they complain about it constantly, but they train for it." As if to confirm this, one of the humans below looked up and noticed the delegation at the viewport. He gave a brief wave. Osei waved back. Then the man turned to a colleague, said something, and they both laughed at something that no one at the viewport could hear through the glass. From the engine room, they went to the reactor level, where the ship's fission reactor hummed in its shielded housing at the center of a large chamber. A team of 4 humans was conducting what their instruments identified as manual inspection, physically walking the exterior of the housing, checking gauges, by tapping pipes, writing observations on actual printed paper forms attached to boards they carried in their hands. "Paper," said Marath's colleague, a technical analyst named Sev, in a tone of pure disbelief. "Electronic systems can fail," said the chief engineer, who had joined the tour at this level. His name was Tomas Reyes. He was broad across the shoulders with hands that were rough and scarred from years of physical work, and he had a way of standing that suggested he was most comfortable when something needed fixing. "Paper doesn't care if the power goes out. If a reactor coolant alarm goes off, I want my team reading from a checklist they can hold, not a screen that might have lost power because of whatever caused the alarm." He shrugged. "Also, some of us just like paper." Marath looked at the team moving around the reactor housing and thought about the logic of that. It was, in its way, completely sound. The weapons bays were next. The railgun batteries ran the length of the ship in great reinforced channels, and the guns themselves were the largest individual weapons Mirath had ever seen at close range. Standing beside one of the railgun barrels was like standing beside a building. The magnets that accelerated the projectiles were wrapped in copper coiling that had clearly been rewound by hand at some point. She could see where the original machine winding ended and the human rewinding began. Slightly less perfect, but functionally identical. The ammunition was stored in rooms the size of small warehouses, stacked in rows. The projectiles themselves were simple, dense metal rods of uniform size, each one the length of a Tharaki adult, stored in racks with serial numbers painted on them by hand. Humans moved between the racks with small vehicles, loading the projectiles into the feed systems. There was no automation to speak of. It was physical work done by people. How many rounds per minute can these fire? Asked Sev. Depends on the crew, said Osei. Our best teams can get 4 rounds per minute on the big guns. We've hit 5 in live fire exercises, but that's not sustainable for long. She glanced at the loading teams. We have a lot of big guns, though. 24, thought Marath. 24 guns the size of buildings, each capable of launching a dense metal rod fast enough to punch through standard conclave shielding. She thought about Defies' weapons simulation from the high command meeting and felt something shift quietly in her assessment of this vessel. Then they went to the damage control center, and Marath found what she privately decided was the most important room on the ship. It was not glamorous. It was a large room full of displays showing the structural status of every section of the unyielding principle, color-coded by condition. Green was fine. Yellow was damaged but stable. Red was immediate problem. There were currently 11 yellow sections and 2 red sections showing on the displays. 12 humans were in the room, monitoring the boards and coordinating teams across the ship via communications headsets. What are the 2 red sections? Mirith asked. Deck 7, Section 12. We took a hit 3 weeks ago, and the structural support in that section is reduced. Teams working on it. We should be back to yellow by tomorrow. Osei pointed to the second red indicator. Deck 14, Section 3. Water main broke and flooded the compartment. We've got it contained, but we're still draining it. A water main broke. Yes. Osei said it with absolutely no embarrassment. It's fixed now. We're just dealing with the water. Marath looked at the board and the humans working it and thought about the concept of damage control as a permanent, active, continuous function of the ship. Not a crisis response, but simply a constant background process, as routine as navigation. It was, she began to understand, the key to everything. The unyielding principle was not a ship that avoided damage. It was a ship that was built to take damage, identify it immediately, and fix it while still fighting. The thickness of the hull bought time. The redundant systems ensured that losing one thing did not mean losing the function. And the humans, their presence everywhere, their willingness to go into hot rooms and crawl through ceilings and do things by hand, they were the living version of the same principle. Redundant, persistent, difficult to stop. After the tour, the diplomatic meeting took place in a room the captain called the officer's lounge. It had a long table and chairs built for human proportions. The delegation sat in theirs with varying degrees of comfort, and someone had placed cups of a hot, dark liquid called coffee in front of each alien visitor, along with the information that they were not obligated to drink it. Marath drank some. It was very bitter and very strong, and she found she appreciated it. Chief Engineer Tomas Reyes was present at the meeting, along with the ship's tactical officer, a tall, quiet woman named Lieutenant Commander Park, and several others. The conversation covered diplomatic topics, formal introductions, the sharing of patrol boundaries, the communication about the engagement in the Dravani corridor. But Mirath kept steering the conversation toward the ship itself, because she had been asked to learn what she could, and because she was genuinely curious. At one point, she asked the engineer directly. She had been building toward it since the engine room. When I want to ask you something, she said. I will try to phrase it without giving offense. She paused. By our models of physics and engineering, this ship should not function. Not at this size, not with this structural approach, not with these drive systems. Every analysis we have run says that something about its design should be causing problems severe enough to prevent it from operating. She looked at Reyes. And yet it operates. Every day, apparently, with you and your crew inside it, doing things by hand and fixing what breaks and keeping it going. How do you explain that gap between what we believe should be true and what is actually happening? Reyes looked at her for a moment. He had large, calm eyes and a way of pausing before he answered. That suggested he was giving questions real thought. You said it should be causing problems severe enough to prevent it from operating, he said. Yes, but it is causing problems. All the time. Plenty of them, he gestured in the direction of the damage control center. 2 red sections on the board today. Yesterday there were 4. Last week, the number 2 railgun battery lost power for 6 hours because a relay burned out. He leaned forward slightly. The difference isn't that our ship doesn't have problems, it's that we fix the problems. Every time. As fast as we can, with whatever we have. He sat back again. You're looking for a design secret. There isn't one. The secret is that we don't stop. Mirith looked at him. Then she wrote those words in her notes, exactly as he had said them. The secret is that we don't stop. The meeting wrapped up, courtesies were exchanged, and the diplomatic team made its way back to the docking airlock. As they passed the open section of ceiling near the entrance corridor, the 2 humans were still there, still working, tools clicking softly against metal above them. One of them called down again as the delegation passed. Heads! Mirith ducked automatically. Then she smiled, her species equivalent of it anyway, and kept walking. Behind her, the unyielding principle hummed and worked and breathed its heat and noise into the darkness of the Cathara expanse. Alive, stubborn, deeply, permanently alive. She had a lot to write in her report that evening. She wasn't sure she knew where to start. The alarm came in at the 2nd hour of the sleep cycle, which meant that half the crew of the unyielding principle was in their bunks when the ship's systems began screaming. Captain Mara Osei was not one of the sleeping half. She had been awake since the 1st hour, sitting in the command chair with a cold cup of coffee and going through a maintenance report that she had been meaning to read for 3 days. When the alarm hit, she was already sitting up straight, her hand moving to the communications panel before the sound had fully registered. Phew, report, she said. The voice of the Night Watch tactical officer came back fast. Sovereignty fleet incoming through the Vathera gate, Captain. Multiple contacts. Still resolving the count. Sensors are being jammed, but I'm getting at least 9. Possibly more. A pause. They're moving fast. Attack formation. Osei was on her feet. Sound general quarters. All hands to stations. Get me a full count as soon as you can and wake the XO. She was already moving toward the main bridge. When the alarm was now a continuous sound through the ship. A deep, repeating tone that every crew member knew meant stop what you are doing and get to your battle station immediately. By the time she reached the bridge, the ship was already transforming around her. She could feel it in the vibration under her feet. The engine output increasing as the drive systems ramped up from patrol mode to combat power. The sound of running footsteps was everywhere. Doors opening and closing. Voices calling short, clear words to each other across corridors. She reached the command chair and looked at the main tactical display. The Vathara Gate was a natural region of space where 2 gravitational fields from nearby collapsed stars created a navigational choke point, the only safe passage through a wide band of unstable space that otherwise took weeks to go around. 17 inhabited systems sat on the far side of it. If you held the gate, you held access to those systems. If you lost it, the enemy could pour through in any numbers they chose. The Conclave's main response fleet was 14 hours away. They had been pulled to the far side of the patrol zone by a false emergency. A classic sovereignty misdirection tactic that the Conclave had fallen for because the false emergency had been very convincingly real. The unyielding principle was the only Conclave vessel at the gate. Osei looked at the display. The sovereignty contacts were resolving now as the jamming partially cleared. The enemy was moving fast and not bothering to hide, which meant they were confident. The count came in from the tactical officer in a steady voice that showed professional training and nothing else. 11 confirmed contacts, Captain. 3 Dominion-class heavy cruisers, 5 Sword-class fast attack ships, 2 support carriers, 1 command vessel. Identified as Sovereignty Flagship Iron Covenant. The tactical officer paused. The Iron Covenant is 2.1 kilometers. Standard Sovereignty main battle configuration. 11 ships, one of them a flagship. The unyielding principle was alone. Osei looked at the display for a long moment. The calculation was simple and the answer was clear. The unyielding principle was not fast enough to run, even if she wanted to. The gate was behind them. Pulling back would mean letting the sovereignty pour through unopposed for 14 hours before the Conclave fleet arrived, and 14 hours was enough time to establish a position that would cost a very great deal of blood to remove. She opened a comm channel to Conclave High Command. The response came back from Admiral Senra personally, which told Osei that they already knew what was happening. Captain Osei, we are aware of the situation. And our fleet is moving as fast as possible, but we estimate 14 hours before. I understand, Admiral. Osei kept her voice level. We'll hold the gate. Send whoever you can when you can. She paused. Osei out. She closed the channel before the Admiral could respond. This was technically a breach of protocol. She did it anyway. She turned to her bridge crew. All of them were at their stations. All of them had heard the exchange. All of them were looking at her. You all know what we're doing, she said. Not a question, a statement. Battle stations, full power to railguns, open all missile bays, damage control teams to preposition, and someone get me a firing solution on that flagship. The unyielding principal turned to face the Sovereignty fleet. The first exchange happened at long range, which was unusual for a battle involving the unyielding principal. The Sovereignty sword-class attack ships came in fast, firing their plasma lances in coordinated bursts. The Sovereignty's standard tactic of high-speed strafing runs, designed to weaken a vessel's shields and shorten its response time before the heavier cruisers moved in. The plasma lances hit. Osei felt the impacts through the ship, not the gentle vibration of distant explosions, but the actual physical shock of energy weapons striking hull at close range. The outer layers of the hull absorbed the hits, converting the energy into heat and spreading it across the layered composite structure. The damage screens showed the outermost layer taking significant damage in 3 sections. Below that, the secondary layers held. Return fire, all railgun batteries, said Lieutenant Commander Park from the tactical station. The unyielding principal fired. 24 railguns, each the size of a building, fired in sequence. Not all at once, which would have overloaded the magnetic systems, one but in a rolling pattern that Park's team had drilled for hundreds of hours until they could execute it without thinking. The sound inside the ship was enormous. A series of deep, resonating crashes that traveled through the hull and were felt in the chest and stomach of every human aboard. The metal projectiles crossed the distance to the Sovereignty attack ships in seconds. The sword-class ships' shields handled the first 3 impacts. They were designed for energy weapons. A kinetic projectile was not an energy weapon, but the shields slowed it enough that the hull behind them could handle the remainder of the impact. The 4th and 5th impacts were different. The shields were already working harder from the first 3 hits, and by the 6th and 7th, 2 of the sword-class ships had hull breaches that their own damage systems were struggling to manage. The 8th projectile hit the forward section of one of the sword-class ships with full force. The ship did not explode dramatically. It simply came apart, the forward section separating from the rest of the hull and tumbling away into space while the rear section spun out of formation, venting atmosphere. 1 sword-class destroyed, said Park. 2 damaged. They're adjusting their approach. They were. The Sovereignty fleet had expected this to be quick. A lone vessel, even a large one, against 11 ships with a flagship in support, should not have been able to damage them in the first exchange. They pulled back slightly and regrouped. Osei could see on the tactical display that the heavy cruisers were moving forward now. They're bringing in the cruisers, said Park. I know, missile bays 1 through 8, fire at the lead cruiser. Full spread. The missiles launched from the unyielding principal's side bays in a dense cluster. Not the guided smart missiles that conclave vessels preferred, but large, fast, physically heavy missiles with conventional warheads, fired in enough numbers that even significant interception would not stop all of them. The Sovereignty cruisers' point defense systems lit up, tracking and destroying missiles in rapid sequence. But the math was not on their side. 9 missiles got through. 9 explosions walked up the length of the lead cruiser's hull, and the cruiser broke off its approach, damaged and pulling back. That was when the Iron Covenant entered the fight. The Sovereignty flagship's weapons were in a different category from the attack ships. The plasma lances it carried were long-range, high-intensity systems designed to penetrate heavy shielding at extended distance. It was not built to fight a ship like the unyielding principal. It is because no one in the Sovereignty had ever considered the possibility that a ship like the unyielding principal might need to be fought. But it was very large and very powerful, and when it opened fire, the hits that landed on the unyielding principal's hull were not impacts that the outer layers could fully absorb. The first hit from the Iron Covenant went through the outer three layers and into the ceramic composite section. The explosion inside the hull blew out two compartments on deck 11. The second hit, 30 seconds later, hit the same area. The Sovereignty's fire control system was good and had identified a weakened section. That hit went deeper. Breach on deck 11, sections 4 through 6, called the damage control officer. Sealing automatically, DC teams responding. Hull integrity, holding at 78% overall. Section 11, 4 through 6 is at 40%. Get those teams in there. The damage control teams were already moving. 4 of them in heavy suits entering deck 11 from the adjacent sections with welding equipment and structural support materials. They worked in the dark. The power had gone out in that section from the hit, using handheld lights and memorized layouts. They worked on the hull from the inside while the battle continued around them. With the ship shaking with impacts above and below them, the sounds of railguns firing, creating a rhythm that they had learned to work around. The battle went on for 9 hours. It was not a glorious battle in the traditional sense. There was no elegant maneuvering. There was no brilliant tactical pivot that changed everything in a moment. The unyielding principle could not outrun the sovereignty ships or outmaneuver them. What it could do was absorb hits and return fire, and keep doing both things long past the point where any calculation said it should have stopped. Ose fought the ship the way Reyes had described to Marath. She did not stop. She adapted. When the Sovereignty's attack ships tried to concentrate fire on the damaged section of deck 11, she turned the ship so that a less damaged section faced them, exposing the Iron Covenant to a direct broadside from 12 of her railguns. When 2 of those railguns were knocked offline by a direct hit, the teams in the gun bays had them back within 40 minutes, having physically replaced the burned-out magnetic coil sections with spares they kept stocked in every gun bay. When the Sovereignty sent boarding craft, small, fast vessels designed to attach to a target hull and cut through, the unyielding principle responded with something that was not in any tactical manual, because it was not something any other ship could do. The pipes that ran through the hull carried steam under pressure. In sections where boarding craft had attached and were cutting through, Chief Engineer Reyes vented that pressure deliberately into the breached areas. The boarding parties that came through found themselves in corridors filled with superheated steam that their suits were not designed for. The Sovereignty had never needed steam-rated boarding suits because no one else had steam pipes in their warships. Our 3 boarding attempts were made. None succeeded. 2 of the boarding teams retreated badly injured. 1 team did not come back at all. At hour 6, the unyielding principle's number 3 railgun battery was knocked offline by a hit that destroyed its firing control systems. The team in that bay spent 22 minutes bypassing the damage control system entirely and wiring the battery to a manual fire control board, a physical panel that one of the loaders operated by hand, timing shots by counting aloud. It was slow. It worked. At hour 7, the main drive cut out. For 4 minutes, the unyielding principle went dead in space, still taking hits, unable to move, its massive frame sitting in the middle of the battle while the Sovereignty ships tried to close in and finish it. Osi kept her voice level on the ship-wide channel, calling damage control and keeping the crew focused. In the engine room, Reyes and his team worked on the drive with the concentrated urgency of people who understood exactly how little time they had. The drive came back. Reyes later described the repair in a technical report as, "We identified the failure point, bypassed the primary control pathway, connected the backup system, and when that didn't work immediately, we hit the junction panel with a wrench, and it worked." The technical report was later archived by Conclave engineers who read it 3 times looking for the part that was a joke. It was not a joke. At hour 8, the unyielding principle had lost 2 complete decks to vacuum, had 17 yellow sections and 5 red sections on the damage board, and had its missile bays down to 20% capacity. It had destroyed 2 Sovereignty attack ships, disabled a 3rd, severely damaged the Iron Covenant, and driven the 2 Sovereignty support carriers out of effective range. The Sovereignty fleet still outnumbered it, but the numbers on the Sovereignty side were not the same numbers as when the battle began, and they had learned something in 8 hours that their commanders had not expected to learn. This ship did not behave the way a ship was supposed to behave when it was taking this much damage. It was supposed to slow down, reduce fire rate, show signs of crew degradation, Slower response times, less coordinated fire, increasing errors. Instead, it kept firing at the same pace. The crews in the bays were still running their loading chants. The damage control teams were still in the red sections. The captain's voice on the communications channels was still level and clear. The sovereignty fleet had damaged the unyielding principle enormously. They had not broken it. At hour 9, the conclave relief fleet arrived. In the sovereignty, already badly damaged, saw the approaching fleet on their sensors and began pulling back through the Vethra gate. The retreat was fast and organized. The sovereignty knew when an engagement had turned. The Iron Covenant, its hull scarred and venting from multiple rail cannon impacts, led the withdrawal. As the last sovereignty ships disappeared back through the gate, the conclave relief fleet entered the battle space and sent a hailing signal. With a response from the unyielding principle came back immediately. Osei's voice calm, with a background noise of ship systems and crew activity. Conclave fleet, this is Captain Osei of the unyielding principle. Gate is clear. Sovereignty forces have withdrawn. A brief pause. We could use some assistance with hull patching on decks 7, 11, and 14, and we're low on railgun ammunition. If anyone has compatible rods, we'll figure out the calibration adjustment. Another pause. Shorter. Good to see you. The lead conclave vessel, a Tharaki heavy cruiser called the Resonant Dawn, held its position for a moment as its bridge crew looked at the unyielding principle on their visual sensors. The human ship was listing 22 degrees to port. It was venting atmosphere from 3 points along its hull. One of its railgun turrets was frozen in place at an angle, unable to rotate. Scorch marks from plasma lance hits ran the length of its port side like burn scars. Pieces of Sovereignty boarding craft were still attached to its hull in 2 places. It was still broadcasting all standard running lights. Its engines were producing normal output. Its remaining railgun turrets were tracking and moving, watching the gate in case anything came back through. The communications officer of the Resonant Dawn looked at all of this for a moment, then opened the channel and said the only thing that seemed appropriate. Captain Osei, the gate is secure. To stand down. From the bridge of the unyielding principle, Mara Osei looked at her crew, at the faces around her, tired and focused, at the damage displays showing how much the ship had taken, at the tactical board now showing nothing but clear space ahead, and she let out a breath she had been holding for 9 hours. Stand down, she said. Someone make coffee. A lot of it. The unyielding principle held its position at the gate, listing slightly, venting gently, looking like something that had been through a great deal and had decided that was all right. It had held. It always held. 3 weeks after the Battle of the Vethra Gate, the Galactic Conclave held a session in its main chamber that was later described by historians as the most significant gathering in 300 years. The chamber was a large, circular room built to hold representatives from all 17 member species, and with elevated seating that curved around a central floor space in a wide arc. The ceiling was high and lit with soft light that changed color slowly over the course of a day cycle. It was a room designed to feel important because the things decided in it usually were. Every seat was full. Admiral Sen Ra sat in the senior military section, watching the representatives file in and take their places. She had attended hundreds of conclave sessions over her long career. She had never seen this particular energy in the room before. A kind of focused, collective tension, like a group of people who all shared a question and were waiting for someone to answer it out loud. At the center of the floor, Dren Uuk of the Solveth stood with his hands folded in front of him. He was the oldest being in the room by a considerable margin, and his presence there was itself unusual. Dren Uuk rarely addressed full conclave sessions. He preferred his research rooms and his documents and his quiet conversations with people he chose carefully. But he had requested this session, and the Council of Speakers had granted it, and so here he was. He waited until the room was fully settled. Then he began. I will not summarize what happened at the Vethra Gate, he said. His voice was not loud, but the chamber was designed for listening, and every word reached every seat clearly. You have all read the reports. Well, you know what one human vessel did against 11 sovereignty ships for 9 hours with no support. I do not need to repeat the numbers. The numbers speak clearly enough. He paused. Around the room, representatives of 17 species were still. Even the Dravani, who were famously restless in meetings, were sitting quietly. "What I want to talk about," said Drenuk, "is what we did not understand before the gate, and what we understand now, because I believe we have made an error. Not a small error, a large and fundamental one, and I believe we have been making it for a very long time without knowing it." He moved slowly to the display screen at the center of the chamber floor and brought up a diagram that everyone in the room had seen before. The cross-section of the unyielding principal's hull. 40 meters of layered metal, ceramic and concrete. The diagram that had made engineers uncomfortable and physicists skeptical and weapons analysts quietly unsettled. When we first saw this," he said, "most of our experts called it primitive, inefficient, a waste of mass that could have been used for better systems, better drives, better weapons." He looked around the room. "I confess I was more careful with my words, but my initial instinct was the same. I looked at this and saw something that belonged in the past, a design philosophy that intelligent engineering had moved beyond." He closed the diagram. He opened a new display, this one showing sensor data from the Battle of the Vathara Gate, frame by frame. The unyielding principle taking 14 consecutive hits from the Iron Covenant and continuing to fire. Its drive cutting out and coming back on in 4 minutes. Its crew repairing a rail battery to manual operation mid-battle. The steam venting through breach sections to repel boarders. The ship, after 9 hours, still broadcasting, still firing, still at the gate. "Ito, what this vessel demonstrated at the Vathara Gate was not primitive," said Drenuk. "It was something we have forgotten how to build. Something we optimized away over 4,000 years of improvement." He turned to face the room fully. "We built ships that are faster, more precise, more powerful in a direct engagement, more efficient in every measurable way than this human vessel. We are very proud of this. We should be. It is a genuine achievement." He let that sit for a moment. "But we also built ships that work correctly when everything goes as planned. Ships whose systems depend on other systems, and when one fails, the ones that depend on it fail too. Ships whose crews are trained for efficiency, not for the moment when efficiency is no longer available, and you must solve problems with whatever you have in your hands." He gestured at the display. "We built ships that are correct. And then we encountered a ship that is not correct. A ship that is heavy and loud and leaking and held together partly with concrete, and we watched it hold the Vathara Gate for 9 hours against an enemy that should have destroyed it in 1. The room was silent. Drenuk let it stay silent for a moment. "We did not lose the gate," he said. 17 systems did not fall under sovereignty occupation, not because of our elegant ships, not because of our precise systems. Oh, because 412 humans on one very ugly ship refused to stop." He stepped back from the display. "I am not here to tell you that our design philosophy is wrong. It is not wrong. I am here to tell you that it is incomplete. We optimized for performance and removed everything that did not contribute to performance. And in doing so, we removed something we did not realize was a weapon. We removed stubbornness. We removed depth. We removed the capacity to take damage that would kill a system and replace that system with a person and a manual process and keep going." He paused. "The unyielding principle cannot beat our best ships in a direct, clean engagement, but it can outlast them. And outlasting, as the gate showed us, is sometimes the only thing that matters." He looked around the room one final time. "I am recommending that the conclave begin a formal study of human engineering principles, with the goal of incorporating elements of their approach into the next generation of our vessel designs. Not replacing our methods, adding to them, giving our ships beneath the precision and the elegance, a layer of something that does not require precision to keep working." He straightened slightly. "I am calling this the irrational margin. It is the part of the design that does not make sense on paper, but that keeps you alive when the paper has burned." He stepped back. Watched the session open for response. Representatives spoke in sequence, some questioning, some skeptical, some immediately convinced, some expressing concerns about cost and mass, and the difficulty of integrating such a different philosophy into existing design processes. The debate went on for hours. This was how the conclave worked, and it worked well. And by the end of the session, a formal commission had been established to study and implement Drenuk's recommendations. It was not a perfect outcome. Nothing decided by 17 species at once could be perfect, but it was a beginning. The award ceremony for the unyielding principle was held 6 days later, aboard Conclave Station Kareth 7, in a hall large enough to hold the entire senior leadership of the conclave, along with representatives from every member species and, at the far end, the crew of the unyielding principle. The ship itself could not dock at Kareth 7. Its hull was still being repaired, and its docking profile was not compatible with the station's bays. It was moored outside, held in position by magnetic clamps attached to its port side by a station work crew who had spent 3 hours figuring out how to attach the clamps to hull plating that was in 2 places actively being welded by the unyielding principle's own engineers, who had not stopped repair work during the mooring process and did not intend to. Inside the hall, the 412 members of the crew stood in rows. They were all in dress uniform, dark, clean, pressed into something approaching sharpness, though several crew members had the look of people who were more comfortable in work clothes and were tolerating the dress uniform with professional patience. At the front of the crew formation stood Captain Mara Osei, and she was the same height she had always been, shorter than most of the alien dignitaries around her. She stood with her hands at her sides and her back straight, and she watched the ceremony with an expression of calm attention. When Conclave High Chancellor Vareth of the Solveth stepped forward to present the unyielding principle with the Conclave's highest military honor, the Seal of the Common Star, awarded only 7 times in the Conclave's history, she stepped forward. Amar accepted it with the handshake greeting that the Chancellor had practiced beforehand and held it for a moment before turning to hold it up for her crew to see. There was a sound from the crew formation, not the rigid silence of a military parade, a sound, a brief collective human sound of pride and recognition that was not quite a cheer and not quite a shout, but something in between, something that moved through the hall and touched the alien dignitaries in ways they found difficult to explain afterward, but felt clearly in the moment. Then Osei turned back to the Chancellor and the microphone and stood in front of it. Admiral Sen Ra, in the front row of the senior leadership section, watched the captain's face and wondered what she would say. She had heard acceptance speeches at events like this before. Long ones, gracious ones, carefully prepared ones. She was prepared to hear something like that. What she heard was 11 words. 11 words delivered in a voice that was clear and quiet and not performing anything, just saying a true thing. We just didn't think quit was one of the options. Then Osei stepped back, and the ceremony continued. Senra looked at the captain for a moment. Then she looked at Drenuk, who was seated 2 places to her right, and found him already looking at her. They held eye contact for a second. And in that second, a great deal was communicated without words. The recognition that something had genuinely changed, that the galaxy was different now in a small but permanent way, that the 11 words they had just heard were going to be repeated in meetings and documents and design rooms for years. In the design rooms, the change was already beginning. On Theraki Prime, in the great shipyard that had built the Eternal Thought and 100 vessels like it, the senior architect Deveni had set up a new workspace. On the wall above his primary design console, he had put a printed image. Not a schematic, not a diagram, just a visual sensor image taken by the Resonant Dawn as it arrived at the Vathara Gate at the end of the battle. The image showed the unyielding principle from the side and slightly above, listing 22 degrees, scarred, venting, missing hull plating in 3 places, 1 turret frozen, 1 barrel dark and still. And the ship was enormous and damaged, and obviously had been through something very bad. And the running lights were on. All of them. Every single one. That detail had stayed with Deveni since he first saw the image. The running lights. Every ship in the conclave, when sustaining that level of damage, redirected power from non-essential systems, including running lights, to critical systems. Running lights were decorative. They served no tactical purpose. When no logical design philosophy kept them on when the ship was fighting for survival. The unyielding principle had kept them on because whatever system controlled them had continued working despite everything, and because no one had told them to shut off, and because the humans aboard probably hadn't thought about them one way or the other, because they were busy fixing things that mattered. But the lights had been on, And to Doveni, looking at that image, they meant something. And they meant the ship had never stopped being a ship, never stopped being whole, never accepted at any level of its construction that it was done. He had started calling his new design philosophy the irrational margin after Drenok's term, but in his personal notes he sometimes used a different phrase, a phrase he had not shared with the committee or the commission, because it was not a technical term and he was not sure it belonged in a technical document. He called it the running lights principle. Build something that keeps its lights on, no matter what hits it, no matter how many systems are failing around the thing that powers the lights. Build it so deep and so redundant and so full of backup solutions and physical fallbacks in human hands to fix what breaks that, even when it should be dark, it isn't. It was not efficient. It would add mass and cost and complexity. Several of his junior engineers had already raised these concerns in early design meetings, and he had told them to note the concerns and then set them aside. The unyielding principle was not efficient. It was alive. He wanted to build ships that were alive. The unyielding principle, once its repairs were complete enough for deep space travel, was assigned a new patrol corridor. The assignment had been debated at the conclave level. Some representatives had suggested the ship be kept near Conclave Station as a symbol, a visible reminder of the Battle of the Gate. Osei, when asked her preference, had said simply that the ship was a warship, and warships should be where they were needed, not where they looked good. The assignment was confirmed, a new patrol corridor, active duty. The crew returned aboard in the week before departure, coming back from leave or from the ship's own repair period, or from the informal conversations with alien engineers that several of them had been pulled into, and that had gone on for days. Reyes came back with a Tharaki engineering manual tucked under his arm. He had traded it for an Earth mechanical engineering textbook, which the Tharaki engineer had received with visible excitement. On the morning of departure, Osei walked the ship from bow to stern. She did this before every deployment, and she wanted to see her ship, not the data from it, the ship itself. She walked the corridors and checked the patches and ran a hand along pipes and looked at the damage control board in the DC center and looked at the weapons bays and the reactor level and the engine room and all the places where the crew lived and worked and kept the unyielding principle moving through the dark. The ship was never perfectly repaired. There was always something on the list, some patch that was not quite smooth, some system that was running at 90% instead of 100, some cable bundle that needed replacement but was functioning adequately and would wait for the next port stop. The list was always 40 items long, sometimes 50. She looked at the list, and then she looked at her ship and felt the deep familiar feeling of it, the hum and heat and noise, the smell of oil and metal, and coffee from the galley 2 corridors away, for the sound of boots on the deck as crew moved to stations for departure prep. This was the unyielding principle, ugly and loud and full of things that needed fixing and full of people who fixed them. She went to the bridge. She sat in the command chair. She picked up her coffee. Hot this time, someone had just made a fresh pot, and she looked at the stars outside the viewing screen. "All departments ready," said the XO. "Take us out," said Osei. The unyielding principle powered its drives. It released the magnetic clamps and moved away from Conclave Station, Karath 7, into the dark. Its engines made the sound they always made, a heavy, sustained thunder that was felt more than heard, a sound that the crew no longer noticed, but that made the walls of the station vibrate slightly as it passed. In the station's observation deck, a small group of people from different species had gathered to watch it go. Marath was there. Doveni was there. Dren Uk, who had come to the station for the ceremony and stayed longer than planned, was there. A dozen others, engineers, diplomats, analysts, officers, who had all had their own encounter with the ship or its crew or the idea of it. They watched the unyielding principle grow smaller against the stars. It was listing very slightly to port still, a minor residual trim issue from the repairs that the crew would correct en route. It was leaving a faint thermal trail from the engines. One of its external sensor arrays was rotating in a way that was slightly irregular, suggesting a bearing that was not quite right and would probably need attention at some point. Its running lights were on, all of them, every one, small against the dark, clear and steady, moving away into the Cathara expanse with the slow, heavy certainty of something that had decided where it was going and was not troubled by the distance. Drennock watched until the lights were small enough that he had to focus to find them against the stars. Then he stood quietly for a moment, and then he turned and walked back toward his research rooms to continue the work he had been doing. He had a great deal to write. He always did. But for the first time in many years, he was writing about something he did not fully understand yet. And the feeling of genuine mystery at the edge of genuine knowledge, was something he had almost forgotten. He found he was glad to have it back. The unyielding principle moved on through the dark. Its lights stayed on. They always did.